Well, I'd like to talk about your reflection about your personal journey of biblical worldview. And also, you taught me biblical worldview, and we walked together in the China mission. So the first question is that, to me, moving to New Mexico from a big metropolitan city from Chicago, millions of people, to Los Alamos, a small town, about 12,000. It's incredible. So how did you make that decision?
Well, I had completed my seminary degree, my Master's of Divinity at Lincoln Christian Seminary, and the degree was in theology and philosophy, and one of the focal points was the biblical worldview and the philosophy of science. I was very intrigued with the reality that it was the Christian biblical worldview that gave birth to modern science, but then modern science was hijacked by the naturalistic worldview. And ever since that hijacking took place, the church has been trying to catch up now for about 200, 300 years. And so ministering to scientists who are Christian, but they don't have a Christian worldview when it comes to their science. That was our primary audience when I first came. And then we began to branch out to witness to men and women who are scientists, PhDs, physics, and all different types of scientific disciplines, and explaining to them that Jesus is Lord over all reality, the entire universe. It's Jesus who spoke the world into being, the whole universe into being, and he knows about all the positrons and mesons and the black holes out in space, and he knows about all that, and that he's Lord of all that. It was worth leaving Illinois and Chicago to come to be a part of a scientific community, to tell the scientists how awesome Jesus is and how he created the universe. And as they do their science, they need to keep that in mind and have a biblical worldview when they do science as opposed to a naturalistic worldview when they do science.
So how many years you stayed in Los Alamos? 20 years?
We are now on our 33rd year.
Oh, wow.
And so we've been here quite some time.
So what did you do? You have a seminar and Bible study? Or?
Well, we had Bible study for a number of Christians to understand biblical worldview. And just because somebody's a scientist and a Christian doesn't mean that their mind was trained in terms of a biblical worldview. And one of the Christians had arranged for us to have a weekly study inside the laboratory where we could invite scientists from all over the laboratory. And the program was called Mega Views, and the big view about the world. And so every Friday we would spend time training Christians in biblical worldview, but once in a while we would open up the session so that non-Christians can come in and can ask us questions about the biblical worldview. And that was the exciting part, because for the first time there were many scientists that thought that the church and science should be separate, and that they are separate and there's no interfacing whatsoever. They didn't know the true history of science, that it was Christians who created modern science. That's all because of how the Bible presents the reality of the world.
Okay, once I heard a joke about a very vivid example that in Los Alamos lab, I heard the story, some kind of anecdote. You mentioned a conversation. When you're a scientist, you leave the faith before you enter in the lab.
Right.
Right? And you enter in the church, you leave your reason at the door. So looking back, do you think you made a contribution to this scientist community in New Mexico?
Yeah, we have made a contribution. MegaViews, we mentioned in our previous segment that MegaViews was the primary format for that, and that we were able to help Christians to understand they only have one mind, and it doesn't come in compartments and chambers, the church part, and then there's the science part. But the creation that Jesus made is one integrated whole, and the human being is one integrated whole, and that truth is truth and knowledge is knowledge. And it doesn't matter whether it's knowledge about the physical world or whether it's knowledge about the spiritual world, that both are verifiable. And the idea that there's a split between so-called faith and reason, and then it comes to politics, the separation of church and state, that this kind of, it's called dualism, that having the human being live in two different worlds, that's not how we were created. And so bringing the world together to see the truth is truth, and that it's an integrated whole is very, very important. We were able to help Christians who do science, number one, to learn the true history of how the scientific revolution came about. You know, people like Copernicus and Galileo and people like Newton and Pascal and others, they were hardcore Christians. They weren't atheists, they weren't agnostics, they weren't deists, they were hardcore Christians that loved Jesus. And so many of the scientists, as they came through the universities, they were told that, you know, faith and reason are separate from each other. So I was expecting to see that when Christians went to work at the laboratory, that they didn't bring their faith up very much because they were taught that there's a conflict there as opposed to an integration there. And then I was expecting that, but then what happened is that I would see that when Christians who did science came from the laboratory to the church, it was like they left their brains at the door. You know, it was all about feelings, it was all about emotion, it was all about sentiment, it was Jesus in my heart, nothing in my head, and there was a complete disconnection as opposed to thinking about who is Jesus? What has he done? What's the purpose of the world? You know, why are we here? And many Christians, even scientific Christians, they've not taken the time to think about that. So one of the things that my presence in Los Alamos is I pressed for churches to, you know, deeply get involved in biblical worldview so that the people who do science in those churches, that are members of those churches, that they can begin to see that there is not a contradiction between faith and reason. For a moment there, I thought you were going to tell the story about when I had the encounter with the scientist, and I had given a lecture at the laboratory, and at the end of the lecture, the scientist came up and he said, "Mr. Redmond, that was just awesome." He says, "But there's one thing I think you need to get straight, and that is, you know, that we scientists, you know, we're men of reason, and you Christians are, you know, people of faith, and the two don't mix." And I said, "Oh," I said, "Well, what do you do here at the lab?" And he said, "Well, XYZ." It wasn't anything you know, classified. He said XYZ. And I said, "Well, how do you approach yours?" "Oh, use scientific theory." And I said, "Well, you know, tell me, you know, how you go about it." And he said, "Well, first, you know, we collect all the data, and then after we, you know, collect all the data." And I said, "Excuse me," I said, "How do you know you have all the data?" And he says, "Well, we believe we have all the data." And I said, "Well, I perceive you're a man of faith." And it caught him short. He didn't realize the assumptions that he had. And then he looked at me and he says, "And I perceive that you're a man of reason." I said, "Well, now that we got that off the table, now we can talk to each other and recognize that truth is integrated, and that scientific truth and truth about God, the maker of the universe, revealing himself to his creation, that they're not compartmentalized, that the human mind is an integrated whole, God is an integrated whole, the creation's an integrated whole, and we can bring this back together so it's not compartmentalized."
So let's go beyond Los Alamos and the scientists, the spheres of influence. I heard you talk about a similar story about in the Congress, that one of a congresswoman, maybe, if I remember, says, "Bill Redmond, please leave your faith before you do the voting," something like that. Can you tell the story?
Sure. Well, a friend of mine, close friend of mine, and it was a female congresswoman, I'd voted yes on an issue and she had voted no, and no was obviously not a position that honored human life or the biblical worldview. And, you know, went to ask her about, and understand that she too was raised in a world that said that everything is compartmentalized, faith and reason, that kind of thing. And so I asked her, I said, well, why'd you vote that way on the issue? And so she began to say, well, now, Bill, I know that you were a pastor before you came here, and I'm a Christian too. And she said, but what you need to realize is that you need to, park your faith outside in the hallway before you come in here onto the floor of the House of Representatives to do the people's, business. And I took that for a nanosecond, a little scientific talk there. And so I asked her, I said, what's the thesis statement of the Declaration of Independence? And she said, well, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And I said, well, how do you know all men are created equal? She said, well, we believe all men are equal. And I said, I see you brought your faith with you onto the floor of the House of Representatives. Every scientist has faith, and every person of quote-unquote faith, we know certain knowledge about the world, and Christians can do science. And as we stated in an earlier episode, that Christianity was the cradle and it gave birth to modern science. And so the idea that there should be this compartmentalization is absolutely false. We need to remember that right before Jesus went to see his Father, he said, all authority in heaven and earth is mine. And because all authority is his, and because he's Lord over the whole creation, there is no compartmentalization from how he sees the world. And we as Christians need to see the world as our Lord sees the world, without the compartmentalization, without the dualism and saying, well, this part is, Jesus has nothing to do with this part of reality. That's just false, because Jesus is Lord of all. And I learned this from one of my favorite authors, and we've shared this before, Francis Schaeffer. The idea that Jesus is Lord over the totality of reality. And as you know, my professor in seminary, Dr. James Strauss, I learned it from him before I learned it from Schaeffer, but Jesus is Lord over every domain of reality, whether it's science, whether it's family, whether it's politics, whether it's education. There's no human endeavor, art, literature, every endeavor that is part of Genesis 1:26, when God said, go and have dominion. And the idea that the gospel and the Bible is only about salvation for when Jesus comes a second time, this is the creation that he's placed us in. And it doesn't matter whether it's science or whether it's government and politics, that everything comes under the lordship of Christ. And we as Christians, that when we look at the world, we need to put on biblical worldview glasses, so when we're looking through the lenses, we're seeing the world as Jesus sees the world, because he's Lord of all.
So how do you think your also either your mission, contribution, and service to New Mexico legislature, conservative communities in New Mexico, or later on you work with the Citizen Link that training 16 states, pastors, church leaders, really get involved in the election. How do you see that? Is any kind of a influence and contribution? And that, to me, it's like a mission impossible.
Right.
Or a mission accomplished.
Right.
How you
right,
look at it back.
Right. Well, the mission won't be complete until Jesus comes. So there's plenty of work to do, and I invite all of our viewers to get on board and see Jesus as Lord of all reality. And it doesn't matter where I go. And you've heard people say, if you ask Bill Redmond a question, what's the answer? Biblical worldview. And that's seeing God's world from God's perspective as he's revealed it to us in the scripture. And so it doesn't matter whether it was the work that I've done with people in the New Mexico legislature on both sides of the aisle, or in Washington, D.C., or working with Citizen Link, which is was the political arm of Focus on the Family. Dr. Dobson had started that organization, and it doesn't matter where I go, I am always conscious that this is the creation of the Lord Jesus, and we need to be seeing things from his perspective. And so in my conversations, whether it's a formal training or whether it's a conversation over coffee, I stress the truth and God's strategy for reaching out to people of all nations, and that Jesus is Lord of all. Even when I'm in China, and there will be times that some of the pastors that are in our sessions, they'll pull me over to the side and we'll run over to McDonald's, and they'll ask me a question, and I flip over the placemat, and I'll tell the story, and I'll take notes on the placemat. But when our conversation's done, some of our Chinese scholars and pastors will say, "Can I have this placemat?" And you see me in front of a whiteboard, and our Chinese friends, they go, "We've never seen this before." And they take a picture of it. And so the teaching, as I present it, the biblical worldview over all, because Jesus is Lord over all reality, that churches in the West, they've missed it. Only a few people have connected with that. As you know, the churches in China and other lands where missionaries went, they went with a gospel, Jesus in my heart and nothing in my head, as opposed to the lordship of Jesus over all reality. And so anywhere I go in the world, people are asking me to talk more about biblical worldview. So the impact is, I can feel it after all these years. I get phone calls, I get emails, and people will say, "Remember when you said something 20 years ago?"
Like what I said.
Absolutely. I had a young pastor, he gave me a call just out of the blue, and I picked it up, and he said, "I remember when you spoke, and you said there's the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But it's difficult to pursue happiness if you're not free, but it's impossible to be free if you're not alive. That the right to life is the right over all rights. It's the most important one." He said that when you said that, it hit me like a ton of bricks. And he called me 20 years later after he had been in ministry that long, and I didn't even remember he was in the audience. So the influence that has taken place in the church, because I've been everywhere I go, talk about the lordship of Jesus over all reality and biblical worldview.
So let's talk about our journey together, because a lot of times I heard about the biblical worldview in 2001 in Colorado Springs. I certainly don't understand, but gradually I heard a lot of your saying, conversation. We fly together and we do ministry together. Certainly you went to China 10 times?
13.
13 times. Okay, so there's
I miss the food and my friends.
There's a lot of funny jokes and a lot of good times. We take the same hotel room, and we have a meeting in the middle of the night and all this. So all come back, as you said, all come back to biblical worldview. What is the stories you want to share with the audience? You feel pretty interesting, funny, or biblical worldview that influence Chinese Christians, even non-Christians.
Right. So, well, first of all, it all began in Colorado Springs in 2001. Oz Guinness was the speaker,
right.
And we had about 150, 200 Chinese leaders from all over the United States and Canada, and some came in from China,
right.
And I can't remember all of what Oz said, but what hit me hard was that he had said, and I'm paraphrasing Oz, he said that all nations rise and fall, all governments rise and fall, and in God's timing, one of these days, communism, not just in China, but across the world, is going to collapse, okay? And he said, and it will happen in China as well. And he said, that's good news. The bad news is that there's nobody in this room that is prepared to be sitting at the table to talk about what will the new China look like, because they were not grounded in a biblical worldview. And I was in the audience, and I sat upside. That was like a calling for me. And that was when it dawned on me that America had walked away from the biblical worldview step by step, where after so many generations, many Christians aren't even aware of it here in the United States, and it has caused the downfall and the incrementally of the United States. And it dawned on me that the missionaries that grew up in American churches went to China and all over the world, and they exported this weak view of Christianity because it wasn't undergirded with the biblical worldview. And I thought that is what not only the Chinese church, but mission churches all over the world had received. And I saw a calling there because I saw that in the 21st century, the number one force of any nation in the 21st century, it's not going to be the United States, it's going to be China. And I thought that this is an opportunity to spread the gospel across the globe in ways never before possible, partly because of the size of the Chinese population, partly because of the Chinese diaspora, but to encourage Christians to be grounded in a biblical worldview and have the opportunity to carry that into all the world. That was so powerful. Again, it's kind of like there have been times you and I have been at Chinese Christian businessmen's meeting, and there were non-Christians that were there, but they were impressed with what we said about biblical worldview. Part of the success of the United States and the American economy has been the biblical worldview in terms of trust and a legal system that's based on a biblical worldview to protect the interest in the work and the assets of both the employee and also the employers. That's part of what made America great. And so as you and I traveled across China, we were able to carry that to universities, we were able to carry that to hospitals, we were able to carry that into the earthquake zone. Publication, yes. And so wherever we went, that was what we carried. Now, I do want to share that when I'm there, I tell the people that I'm Irish, and I tell them about my background, and that my ancestors, they were cannibals. They practiced headhunting and decapitation. They practiced child sacrifice. And all of that wasn't the problem. That was the result of the problem. The problem was they didn't know who God was. But once they knew who Jesus was and that he was Lord over all the universe, it ended the cannibalism, it ended the headhunting, it ended the slavery, it ended women being property. There were all kinds of things that changed because a biblical worldview came to Ireland, to my people.
That's by St. Patrick.
Yeah, and that's St. Patrick. That's St. Patrick. And so, and you've heard me say in front of communist leaders, that's my prayer for China. My prayer is, it's not that the people in China are headhunters or anything like that or cannibals, but it's that every nation that does not know God in some way is going to bring harm to its people in various ways. But when the gospel comes and a society sees that Jesus is Lord and the dignity and value of human life, massive transformation. And so I saw that. Now, the reverse of that is when a Christian nation goes into decline. One of the big examples of that is Germany. Germany gave us the Reformation and the Bible and the printing press, okay? Well, how could a Christian nation that gave us the Reformation and the Bible like that, how could they end up doing something like what the Nazis did with the concentration camps and with Hitler's? How did it go from a Christian nation? Well, it was a naturalistic worldview. There was a change in worldview as opposed to the nation being structured around a biblical worldview. They moved the biblical worldview to the side. They put a naturalistic worldview in center, and it was a naturalistic worldview that gave rise to all these atrocities to Jews and so many other people. Even the church participated in that. And this is a warning to pastors. And I'll give you an example. There's a pastor by the name of Martin Niemöller. He's famous for what's called the Niemöller Confession. And he says, well, you know, the Nazis, they came for the trade unionist, and I wasn't a trade unionist, and I didn't speak up. They came for the communists. I wasn't a communist, so I didn't speak up. They came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't speak up. Now they're here for me. There's no one else to speak up for me, okay? But he didn't write that until after he'd spent 8 years in 2 different concentration camps. But Martin Niemöller and other pastors early on, they didn't understand the naturalistic worldview, they didn't understand the Christian worldview, and because they understood neither and did not see the threat, they supported Hitler and they helped bring him into power. And there were Christians and pastors that helped Hitler come into power and to eventually create the concentration camps. So when Christians abandon the biblical worldview, or they don't understand the biblical worldview and they don't understand the competing worldviews, that they run the risk of becoming idolatrous. And when the church, God's people in any generation, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament or right now, that whenever the biblical worldview is put to the side, the dignity of the human being is lost because they forgot who God was. And that's idolatry, and people suffer from that. So my hope and prayer is that the Christians in China, that they will fully grasp a biblical worldview and bring a brand new era of freedom and dignity for humans in China.